Ambassador Veltar stepped off the transport ship and onto the landing platform of New Sol Prime, and the first thing that struck him was how wrong everything felt. The human colony stretched out before him like a fortress disguised as a city, with walls that rose too high and too thick for any peaceful settlement. Guard towers dotted the landscape like metal flowers, and every building seemed designed to withstand a siege that might never come. Veltar had visited dozens of colonies across the galaxy, but none had ever made him feel like he was walking into a military base instead of a home. The welcoming committee waited at the platform's edge, and Veltar recognized their leader from the files he had studied during the journey. Kang Minho stood tall and straight, wearing civilian clothes that could not hide his military bearing. His handshake was firm but not aggressive, and his smile seemed genuine enough. But Veltar noticed how Minho's eyes constantly scanned the surroundings even while they talked. It was the behavior of someone who expected trouble at any moment. "Welcome to New Sol Prime, Ambassador," Minho said in perfect galactic standard. "I hope your journey was comfortable. We have prepared quarters for you in the diplomatic sector, and I am sure you will find everything to your satisfaction." Veltar nodded politely, but his attention was already wandering to the details that made this place so unsettling. Children played in a nearby park, but even their playground equipment looked like it could be converted into defensive positions. The swings had reinforced chains that seemed too strong for their purpose, and the climbing structures were made of the same metal used in military fortifications. Parents watched their children play, but every adult wore at least one weapon openly on their belt or shoulder, as casually as they might wear jewelry. "The colony seems very well protected," Veltar said carefully, testing the waters of conversation. "We believe in being prepared," Minho replied, and something in his voice suggested that this was all the explanation Veltar would receive for now. As they walked through the streets toward the diplomatic quarters, Veltar observed more troubling details. Street vendors sold fresh produce alongside ammunition. A bakery displayed beautiful cakes in one window and emergency rations in the next. Children walked to school in small groups, each group accompanied by an armed adult who was obviously not a teacher. The adults moved with a coordination that spoke of extensive training, and even the youngest children seemed aware of their surroundings in a way that felt unnatural. "How many people live in New Sol Prime?" Veltar asked. "About 2 million, Minho answered. "We are one of the smaller human colonies, but we are proud of what we have built here. 2 million people living in what amounted to a military fortress," Veltar thought. The Galactic Council's concerns were beginning to seem more justified with every step he took. He had read the reports about human expansion, about how every human settlement was fortified far beyond what seemed necessary for protection against wildlife or natural disasters. The other species in the galaxy were starting to worry that humans were preparing for some kind of massive war, though no one could figure out who they planned to fight. They passed a school where children practiced evacuation drills in the courtyard. The exercise was conducted with military precision, and even the youngest students moved quickly and quietly to their designated positions. Teachers carried weapons openly, and Veltar noticed that the school building itself was constructed like a bunker with thick walls and narrow windows that could serve as firing positions if needed. "Your education system seems very focused on emergency preparedness," Veltar observed. "Children should know how to stay safe," Minho said simply. At the diplomatic quarters, Veltar was introduced to Lee Nari, the chief security officer for the colony. She was a compact woman with sharp eyes and scars on her hands that spoke of extensive combat experience. Like Minho, she carried herself with military bearing, but there was something else in her manner that Veltar could not quite identify. It was not aggression or hostility, but rather a kind of watchful protectiveness, like a parent constantly alert for threats to their children. "Ambassador, we hope you will feel safe during your stay with us," Nari said. "If you need anything or notice any concerns, please contact me immediately." "I appreciate your attention to security," Veltar replied. "But I must ask why it seems so necessary. Your colony appears to be in a peaceful sector with no known threats." Nari and Minho exchanged a glance that lasted only a fraction of a second, but Veltar caught it. There was something they were not telling him, some knowledge. They shared that explained everything he had observed. Space can be dangerous, Nari said finally. We prefer to be ready for anything. That evening, Veltar was invited to dinner at Minho's home, which turned out to be as fortified as everything else in the colony. The house was beautiful and comfortable, but the windows were made of reinforced material, and the doors were thick, enough to stop military-grade weapons. Minho's family welcomed Veltar warmly, and the conversation was pleasant, but even here the strange atmosphere persisted. Minho's wife served a delicious meal while wearing a sidearm, and their teenage daughter casually cleaned a rifle while discussing her studies in engineering. It was surreal to watch a family that seemed so normal in every way except for their casual relationship with deadly weapons. Your daughter is very skilled with that weapon, Veltar commented. All our children learn to protect themselves and others, Minho's wife replied. It is part of growing up human. After dinner, Veltar thought he might finally get some answers when Park Ji-hoon arrived. Ji-hoon was introduced as a civilian engineer, a young man in his 20s who worked on the colony's infrastructure systems. He seemed more relaxed than the others, less formal in his manner, and Veltar hoped he might be more willing to discuss the colony's unusual characteristics. Ji-hoon helps maintain our defensive systems, Minho explained, but his real passion is building things that help people live better lives. Defensive systems seem to be a major focus here, Veltar said. To Ji-hoon, do you mind me asking why a civilian engineer works on military installations? Ji-hoon looked genuinely puzzled by the question. They are not military installations, he said. They are just part of keeping people safe. Everyone does their part. But the level of fortification seems extreme for a peaceful colony. Peaceful does not mean defenseless, Ji-hoon replied. And again Veltar sensed that there was more to this answer than appeared on the surface. The evening's strangest moment came when Minho's neighbors arrived with their young son to celebrate the boy's 10th birthday. The party was cheerful and normal in most respects, with cake and games and laughter. But when it came time for gifts, Veltar watched in fascination and horror as the child unwrapped a beautifully crafted knife. The adults gathered around as Minho performed what was clearly a ceremony, speaking words in an old human language that Veltar did not understand. The knife was passed from hand to hand among the adults, each one saying something over it, before it was finally presented to the birthday boy. The child accepted the weapon with obvious pride and reverence, promising to use it only to protect himself and others. It is a tradition, Minho's wife explained to Veltar. When our children reach 10 years old, they receive their first blade and learn the responsibility that comes with the power to harm others. Veltar watched the ceremony with growing unease. This was not just a heavily armed colony, but a society that was raising its children to be warriors from the earliest possible age. Every human he had met seemed kind and reasonable, but they were also preparing for some kind of conflict that they refused to discuss openly. As he walked back to his quarters that night, Veltar looked up at the guard towers that surrounded the colony and wondered what the humans knew that the rest of the galaxy did not. Tomorrow he would begin his formal investigation, but already he suspected that the answer to his questions would be far more complex and disturbing than anyone on the Galactic Council had imagined. Veltar spent his second day on New Sol Prime trying to understand what he had witnessed at the birthday ceremony, but every human he approached gave him the same polite but unhelpful responses about tradition and safety. It was frustrating to encounter such consistent evasion from people who seemed otherwise honest and straightforward, and by afternoon he was ready to try a different approach. Dr. Choi Hanul worked in the colony's historical archive, a building that was as heavily fortified as everything else but filled with books and data storage devices instead of weapons. She was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and careful mannerisms, and when Veltar explained that he wanted to learn about human history and culture, she seemed reluctant to help him. Most of our historical records are restricted, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. I can show you some general cultural information, but anything more detailed would require special authorization. I am an official diplomatic representative, Veltar reminded her. Surely I have access to basic historical information. Hanul hesitated, then seemed to come to some internal decision. Very well, she said quietly. But you must understand, that human history is not always pleasant reading. She led him to a small viewing room where she activated a holographic display system. The first records she showed him were exactly what Veltar expected to see: standard colonial documentation about settlement patterns and population growth. Early human expansion into space had been slow and careful, with small groups establishing research stations and trading posts on worlds throughout this sector of the galaxy. Your people seem to have been quite peaceful in their early expansion, Veltar observed. Yes, Hanul said, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. We were very peaceful, perhaps too peaceful. The record showed that the first human settlements had been built like research facilities rather than fortresses, with minimal defensive capabilities and open designs that welcomed visitors from other species. Children played in unguarded playgrounds, and adults worked in buildings with large windows and multiple entrances. It was completely different from what Veltar had observed in New Sol Prime, as if he were looking at records from a completely different species. What changed? He asked. Hanul's hands trembled slightly as she changed the display, and Veltar saw that the next set of records were marked with warnings about disturbing content. This is classified material, she said. I should not be showing you this, but perhaps it is time that someone outside humanity understood. The holographic display showed a space station orbiting a distant planet, a beautiful structure of gleaming metal and transparent materials that looked more like a work of art than a defensive installation. Children could be seen playing in observation, lounges with vast windows that offered spectacular views of space, and adults moved through corridors that were wide and bright and welcoming. Kepler Station, Hanul said quietly, our first major colony, home to 30,000 people, men, women, children, all living together in peace and prosperity. It looks wonderful, Veltar said, though he noticed that Hanul was using past tense. It was wonderful, she agreed, until the Shardai found us. Veltar knew the Shardai, by reputation, a warrior species that had conquered several smaller civilizations before being contained by the combined efforts of the Galactic Council. They had been restricted to their home system for over a century, their expansion halted by diplomatic and military pressure from the more peaceful species. The Shardai attacked your colony. Attacked is not the right word, Hanul said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. They destroyed it completely. Every person, every structure, everything that showed humans had ever existed there. The display changed to show the aftermath, and Veltar had to fight to keep from turning away. Where Kepler Station had been, there was nothing but debris and empty space. The beautiful structure that had housed 30,000 people was gone, vaporized, by weapons that were designed to leave no survivors and no evidence. The Shardai sent a message to Earth afterward, Hanul continued. They said that humans were weak and unworthy of space, that we should return to our home planet and never venture out again. They said that any human colony they discovered would meet the same fate as Kepler Station. Veltar stared at the empty space where the colony had been, trying to process what he was seeing. 30,000 people, he said. 30,000, Hanul confirmed, including 8,000 children under the age of 10. Suddenly, the fortified walls and guard towers of New Sol Prime made more sense. The humans were not preparing for conquest. They were preparing for survival against an enemy that had already proven capable of genocide. But the Shardai were contained over 100 years ago, Veltar said. Yes, they were contained, Hanul agreed. But the lesson remained. We learned that being peaceful and trusting was not enough to protect our families. She changed the display again, showing him records from the years following the destruction of Kepler Station. Human expansion had stopped completely for nearly a decade while Earth struggled to decide how to respond to the threat. Some wanted to abandon space entirely, while others argued for building a military force strong enough to challenge the Shardai directly. We chose a third path, Hanul explained. We decided to continue expanding, but never again would a human settlement be defenseless. The records showed the construction of the first fortified human colonies, defensive installations that could withstand significant attacks while still serving as homes for civilian populations. Every adult was trained in combat and emergency response, and every child learned from an early age how to survive in a hostile universe. So the weapons, the fortifications, all of it is because of what happened at Kepler Station. Not just because of it, Hanul said, because of what it taught us about the universe we live in. There are species out there that see kindness as weakness, that interpret peaceful intentions as invitations to violence. Veltar was beginning to understand, but there was still something missing from the picture. If this is all about defense, why do the other species in the galaxy see humans as aggressive? Hanil gave him a sad smile. Because we refuse to be victims again, she said. When we encounter a threat to any human colony, we respond with overwhelming force. When pirates attack our trade routes, we hunt them down and destroy them completely. When anyone threatens human civilians, we make sure they never have the opportunity to threaten anyone again. That does sound rather aggressive. Perhaps it does, she agreed. But you have to understand what drives us. Every human alive today knows about Kepler Station. We tell the story to our children so they will understand why we live the way we do. The display showed more recent records, documentation of human responses to various threats over the past 2 centuries. In every case, the human reaction was swift and devastating. But Veltar noticed something interesting in the details. The humans always targeted the specific individuals or groups responsible for attacks, never entire species or innocent populations. You practice precise retaliation, he observed. We practice effective protection, Hanul corrected. We learned that showing mercy to those who prey on the innocent is just another form of cruelty toward their future victims. Commander Yu Daiho arrived while they were reviewing the records, a grizzled veteran with metal prosthetics replacing his left arm and leg. Hanul introduced him as one of the few survivors of Kepler Station, and Veltar realized he was looking at someone who had witnessed the massacre as a child. You want to know why we are heavily armed? Daiho asked, settling into a chair with obvious discomfort from old injuries. I was 7 years old when the Shardai came. I watched from a supply closet while they killed my parents and my sister. His voice was calm and steady, but Veltar could see the pain in his eyes that time had never fully healed. I spent 3 days in that closet before a rescue ship found me, Daiho continued. 3 days listening to the silence where 30,000 people used to live and breathe and dream about the future. How did you survive when everyone else died? Luck, Daiho said simply. Pure random luck. My mother pushed me into that closet when the attack started, and the Shardai missed it when they swept through to confirm kills. Hanul and Daiho exchanged glances, and Veltar sensed another layer of communication that he was not privy to. There were actually several dozen survivors, Hanul said quietly. Children mostly, hidden in small spaces or protected by parents who died to save them. They were scattered throughout human space afterward, adopted by families who raised them with the knowledge of what can happen when good people are caught unprepared. And now those children are adults who help design our defensive systems, Daiho added. We make sure that no human child will ever again have to hide in a closet while monsters kill their family. Veltar looked at the records again, seeing them now through different eyes. The fortifications and weapons were not signs of aggression but of determination, an entire species united by shared trauma and a commitment to never again be helpless victims. Every human settlement is built like a fortress because every human settlement is potentially the last refuge for innocent people who deserve to live in peace, Hanul said. We are heavily armed because we learned that being lightly armed is not enough. Veltar decided to spend his 3rd day observing ordinary human life, hoping to understand how the lessons of Kepler Station had shaped daily existence in the colony. Kim Sora had volunteered to let him shadow her routine, and she seemed like an ideal subject for his study. She was a mother of 2 young children, worked part-time as a systems analyst, and served in the colony's civilian militia on weekends. If anyone could show him how humans balanced normal life with their preparations for defense, it would be her. Sora met him at dawn outside the colony's central communications hub, where she worked 3 days a week monitoring automated systems that tracked everything from weather patterns to deep space sensor readings. She was a compact woman in her 30s with calloused hands and alert eyes. dressed in practical clothing that managed to look both professional and ready for emergency action. "Good morning, Ambassador," she said cheerfully. "I hope you do not mind starting early, but there is a lot to do today." "I am grateful for the opportunity to observe," Veltar replied. "I want to understand how ordinary humans live in your colonies." Sora laughed, but not unkindly. "I am not sure any humans are ordinary anymore," she said. "We all carry responsibilities that our ancestors never had to think about." Inside the communications hub, Veltar watched as Sora checked overnight reports from automated monitoring stations scattered throughout the system. She explained that every human colony maintained constant surveillance of the space around them, not just for immediate threats but for any unusual activity that might indicate future problems. "Do you ever detect actual threats?" Veltar asked. "More often than you might think," Sora replied, pointing to several alerts on her display. "Most of them turn out to be false alarms or minor issues, but we have to investigate everything. Last month we tracked what looked like a damaged freighter that turned out to be pirates scouting our defenses. What happened to the pirates?" "We sent a patrol to escort them out of the system," she said matter-of-factly. "They were given the choice to leave peacefully or be arrested. They chose to leave." After finishing her work at the communications hub, Sora took Veltar to her home, which was located in a residential district that looked almost normal except for the subtle defensive modifications that were becoming familiar to him. Her house had reinforced walls and narrow windows, but it was also warm and comfortable, filled with children's artwork and family photographs. Her son, Kim Taemin, was 8 years old, and her daughter Kim Hyung was 11, and both children greeted Veltar politely before settling down to breakfast. What struck him immediately was how mature they seemed for their ages, displaying a kind of calm awareness that reminded him of military personnel. "Today is a school day for you two," Sora told them. "But remember that this afternoon we have emergency drill practice." "Can I practice with the advanced group today?" Hyung asked hopefully. "If you can demonstrate proper evacuation procedures with the beginners first," Sora agreed. Veltar watched as the children prepared for school, noting how they automatically checked small emergency kits that were attached to their backpacks. Each kit contained basic medical supplies, a communication device, and what appeared to be several days' worth of emergency food and water. "Is it normal for children to carry survival equipment to school?" he asked. "It is normal for everyone to be prepared for emergencies," Sora replied. "Children learn these habits early so they become automatic." On the walk to school, Veltar observed how the children moved in small groups with adults strategically positioned to maintain visual contact with all of them. The adults carried weapons openly, but also medical supplies and communication equipment, and their attention seemed focused on watching for any signs of trouble, rather than looking for opportunities to use their weapons. "The adults who escort children to school," Veltar said, "are they teachers?" "Some are teachers, some are parents, some are just neighbors who volunteer," Sora explained. "Everyone takes turns because every adult has a responsibility to protect every child." At the school, Veltar was introduced to the principal, an older woman named Mrs. Park who had been an educator for over 30 years. She gave him a tour of the facilities, which included normal classrooms alongside specialized training areas where children learned emergency response procedures. "Our curriculum includes standard academic subjects," Mrs. Park explained. "But we also teach practical skills like first aid, basic engineering, and situational awareness." "Do the children enjoy learning these skills?" "Most of them do," she said. "They understand that knowledge can save lives, and children naturally want to learn things that make them feel capable and secure." In one classroom, Veltar watched as 10-year-olds practiced assembling communication equipment while reciting mathematical formulas. In another, teenagers worked together to solve engineering problems that involved reinforcing structures against simulated attacks. The lessons were taught as practical applications rather than abstract theories, and the students seemed genuinely engaged with the material. "Why do you teach children about fortification and defense?" Veltar asked one of the teachers. "Because they will need to know these things as adults," the teacher replied simply. "Every human adult is responsible for the safety of their community, and that responsibility requires both knowledge and skill. After leaving the school, Sora took Veltar to the colony's medical center, where she volunteered as a part-time medic. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than seemed necessary for a community of 2 million people, with emergency treatment capabilities that could handle mass casualties and specialized equipment for treating combat injuries. "Do you see many combat injuries here?" Veltar asked. "Not often," Sora admitted. "But when we do see them, we need to be ready to save lives quickly and efficiently." Dr. Kim Jongseo, the chief medical officer, explained that every human settlement maintained medical capabilities far beyond what would be needed for normal civilian healthcare. They trained constantly for emergency scenarios and maintained supplies that could treat hundreds of casualties simultaneously. "Medical preparedness is just as important as weapons training," Dr. Kim said. "The goal is always to preserve life, whether that means preventing harm or treating harm after it occurs." The afternoon emergency drill that Sora had mentioned turned out to be a complex exercise involving the entire residential district. When the alarm sounded, every family evacuated their homes and moved to designated assembly points with practiced efficiency. Children helped younger children, adults assisted elderly neighbors, and within minutes the entire area was cleared and secured. "How often do you practice these drills?" Veltar asked as he watched families check in at assembly points. "Once a month for major evacuation exercises," Sora replied, "and smaller drills every week for specific scenarios." "What kind of scenarios?" "Fire, structural damage, medical emergencies, hostile intrusion, system failures, anything that might require coordinated response from the community." Veltar noticed that during the drill, every adult automatically assumed specific roles without being told what to do. Some became medics, others became engineers, still others became security, personnel, or communications coordinators. It was like watching a military unit deploy, except that these were supposedly civilian families. "Everyone knows their emergency role?" he asked. "Everyone trains for multiple roles," Sora explained. "We never know who might be available during a real crisis, so we all learn to fill different positions as needed." The drill concluded with a critique session where participants discussed what had gone well and what needed improvement. Veltar was struck by how seriously even the youngest children took this process, offering suggestions and asking questions about how to make the next drill more effective. Later that evening, Sora's family invited Veltar to dinner, and he found himself in the unusual position of sharing a meal with people who discussed defensive strategies and emergency procedures, as naturally as other families might talk about sports or entertainment. "Mama," young Taman said during dessert, "why do the ambassador's people not learn to protect each other the way we do?" Sora looked embarrassed by her son's directness, but Veltar was curious about the child's perspective. "What makes you think my people do not protect each other?" he asked gently. "Because you seem surprised that we do," Taman replied with the brutal honesty that children sometimes display. "Do you not love your families enough to learn how to keep them safe?" The question hit Veltar harder than he had expected. His own species had developed advanced technology and sophisticated diplomatic protocols, but they had never faced the kind of existential threat that had shaped human society. They relied on the Galactic Council and mutual defense treaties to maintain peace, but they had never been forced to develop the personal and community-level resilience that he was observing among the humans. "We love our families very much," he said carefully, "but we have been fortunate enough to live in peace for many generations." "That is good," Taman said seriously. "But what would happen if the peace ended?" Veltar realized that he did not have a good answer to that question. His people had grown comfortable with the assumption that peace would continue indefinitely. Veltar was reviewing his notes from the previous day when the alarm began sounding throughout New Sol Prime, a low, wailing tone that he had heard during emergency drills, but which now carried an urgency that made his skin crawl. Within seconds, the streets outside his quarters filled with humans moving with practiced efficiency toward predetermined positions, and he realized that this was not a drill. Commander Lee Nari appeared at his door before he could decide what to do, wearing full combat gear and carrying weapons that looked far more serious than the sidearms he had seen during his daily observations. Her expression was grim but focused, and when she spoke, Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "Ambassador, we have a situation," she said without preamble. "The research station at Kepler-7 is under attack by Raven pirates, and we are mounting a rescue operation. You requested to observe human defensive capabilities in action, and this is your opportunity." Veltar felt his heart racing as he tried to process what she was telling him. "How many people are at the research station?" 347, including research staff from 12 different species and their families, Nari replied. "The pirates have disabled their communications and their defensive systems. We estimate we have maybe 4 hours before the situation becomes unsalvageable." "What do you need from me?" "Stay out of the way and observe," she said bluntly. "You wanted to understand why humans are heavily armed. Today, you will see exactly why." At the military command center, Veltar was introduced to Captain Song Minji, who was leading the rescue operation. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp intelligence in her eyes and an air of absolute confidence that reminded Veltar of the most capable officers he had encountered in other militaries throughout the galaxy. "The Raven pirates specialize in taking research stations," Minji explained as she reviewed tactical displays. "They capture the researchers and sell them as slaves, then strip the facilities of anything valuable before destroying the evidence. How often do they attack installations in this sector?" "This is their third attempt in the past 2 years," she replied grimly. "The first 2 times they targeted non-human facilities, and by the time anyone responded, there was nothing left to rescue." Veltar watched as the command center coordinated the deployment of 3 different ships and nearly 200 personnel, all moving with an efficiency that spoke of extensive training and preparation. What struck him was that the humans were not just planning a military strike against the pirates, but a complex rescue operation that prioritized saving lives over destroying enemies. "Our primary objective is evacuation of all civilians," Minji announced to her team. "Secondary objective is capture of pirate vessels and crew for interrogation. Destruction of enemy forces is authorized only as necessary to accomplish the primary and secondary objectives." Veltar found himself assigned to monitor the operation from the command ship alongside Medic Lim Wujin, a soft-spoken man who seemed far too gentle to be part of a military operation. Wujin explained that his role was to coordinate medical treatment for rescued civilians and captured pirates alike. "Do you provide medical care to the pirates who attack you?" Veltar asked. "We provide medical care to anyone who needs it," Wujin replied simply. "Pirates are still people even if they make terrible choices." The journey to Kepler-7 took 2 hours, during which Veltar observed the final preparations for the rescue operation. Every human on the ship seemed to know exactly what they were supposed to do, and equipment was checked and double-checked with meticulous attention to detail. Engineer Bei Hyan showed Veltar the specialized tools that had been prepared for the mission, including devices designed to restore power and communications to damaged facilities, medical equipment capable of treating multiple species, and weapons that could disable enemies without causing permanent harm. "These weapons are designed for non-lethal incapacitation," Hyan explained. "They can stop an attacker instantly, but they do not cause lasting damage unless we specifically choose more lethal settings." "Why not use lethal weapons exclusively?" "Because the goal is to stop threats, not to create corpses," Hyan said. "Dead pirates cannot provide information about other planned attacks, and they cannot learn to make better choices in the future." When they arrived at Kepler-7, Veltar got his first look at the research station under attack. It was a beautiful facility built around a natural asteroid, with domed sections that provided Earth-like environments for the researchers and their families. 3 pirate ships were docked with the station, and scanner readings showed that the pirates had already begun looting operations in several sections. "Civilian life signs are concentrated in the central habitat dome," reported the sensor operator. "It looks like the pirates have herded everyone into one location." "Standard pirate protocol," Minji said grimly. "They gather the prisoners in one place to make them easier to manage while they strip the facility." The rescue operation began with surgical precision, as human ships disabled the pirate vessels without destroying them, cutting off their ability to escape while preserving evidence for later investigation. Simultaneously, Boarding teams infiltrated the research station through service tunnels that the pirates had not thought to guard. Veltar watched through remote sensors as the human teams moved through the station, and what he saw challenged everything he thought he understood about military operations. The humans advanced carefully and quietly, using non-lethal weapons to disable pirates they encountered, but their primary focus was clearly on locating and protecting civilians, rather than engaging in combat. Team 2, we have found a group of researchers hiding in Laboratory Section C, came a report over the communications system. 12 individuals from the Helix Confederation, including 3 children. They are frightened but unharmed. Copy that, Minji responded. Escort them to Evacuation Point Alpha and provide medical screening. Team 4 reporting, came another voice. We have encountered 6 pirates in the Habitat Dome. They are using civilian hostages as human shields. This was the moment that Veltar expected to see human aggression unleashed. But instead he watched as the rescue teams adapted their tactics to protect the hostages above all other considerations. Rather than attacking directly, they used distractions and misdirection to separate the pirates from their captives, then disabled the attackers with precision weapons that left the hostages completely unharmed. The safety of innocents always takes priority, Wu Jin explained quietly to Veltar. We will accept greater risks to ourselves rather than endanger civilians. As the operation continued, Veltar observed something that he had not expected to see. When pirates were captured, they were immediately provided with medical attention and treated with basic dignity, even though they had been in the process of enslaving innocent people. Human medics checked them for injuries and provided treatment, without regard for the fact that these same individuals had been threatening to kill civilians just moments before. Why do you treat captured enemies so well? He asked Wu Jin. Because how we treat our enemies says more about who we are than how we treat our friends, the medic replied. We fight when we must, but we do not become monsters in the process. The most dramatic moment of the rescue came when it was discovered that one section of the research station was on fire, trapping a group of civilians from multiple species, including several members of Veltar's own people. The human response was immediate and decisive, with Engineer Hyon leading a team directly into the flames to evacuate people who were not even human citizens. Why risk your lives for people who are not your responsibility? Veltar asked Captain Minji. Because they are people, she replied without hesitation. Responsibility is not determined by citizenship or species. If someone needs help and we can provide it, then helping them is our responsibility. Veltar watched as Hyon and his team fought through smoke and flames to reach the trapped civilians, using improvised equipment and creative engineering to create safe passages through damaged sections of the station. The humans put themselves in serious danger to save people they had never met, people whose governments were not allied with humanity, people who had no claim on human protection except for their basic right to live. By the time the operation was complete, all 347 civilians had been successfully evacuated, 31 pirates had been captured alive, and the research station had been secured with minimal permanent damage. The human casualties were limited to minor injuries and smoke inhalation, despite the fact that they had been outnumbered and operating in unfamiliar territory. How do you achieve such successful results with so few losses? Veltar asked as the rescued civilians were processed through medical screening. Training, preparation, and the right priorities, Minji said. We train constantly for scenarios like this. We maintain equipment specifically designed for rescue operations, and we never forget that the primary goal is to preserve life. During the journey back to New Sol Prime, Veltar had the opportunity to speak with some of the rescued civilians, including 3 members of his own species who had been working at the research station. Their gratitude toward the humans was overwhelming, but what struck him was their surprise at how they had Veltar spent the day after the rescue operation, trying to organize his thoughts and observations into a coherent report for the Galactic Council. But every time he began writing, he found himself struggling to explain the complexity of what he had discovered. The humans were indeed heavily armed and extensively militarized, but their motivations and methods were so different from traditional military cultures that standard diplomatic terminology seemed inadequate to describe them. Admiral Cho Sunwoo, arrived at New Sol Prime that morning to personally oversee the interrogation of the captured Raven pirates, and when she learned about Veltar's investigation, she offered to show him something that few non-humans had ever been permitted to see. She was an impressive woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold decades of difficult decisions, and when she spoke about human military philosophy, there was a weight to her words that commanded attention. Ambassador, you have spent several days observing our colonial defenses and emergency response capabilities, she said as they walked toward the military command complex. But I think you have not yet understood the full scope of what humanity has built. In response to our history, I would be grateful for any additional insight, Veltar replied honestly. Admiral Cho led him to a secure briefing room, where she activated a holographic display showing the entire human settlement network throughout this sector of the galaxy. Veltar had known that humans had expanded rapidly over the past 2 centuries, but seeing their colonies mapped in 3 dimensions was striking. Every human settlement was positioned to provide mutual support to its neighbors, and the defensive capabilities he had observed at New Sol Prime were apparently standard throughout human space. What you see here is not an empire, Admiral Cho explained. It is a network of mutually supporting communities, each one capable of defending itself and assisting others when necessary. The coordination must be enormous, Veltar observed. It is, but coordination is easier when everyone shares the same fundamental goal, which is to ensure that no sentient being in our sphere of influence ever dies helpless and alone, as our ancestors did at Kepler Station. The display changed to show incident reports from across human space, documenting hundreds of rescue operations and defensive actions over the past several decades. Pirates, slavers, natural disasters, equipment failures, medical emergencies, every kind of threat that could endanger civilian populations had been met with immediate and effective human response. You respond to threats against non-human populations as well, Veltar noted as he reviewed the records. Of course we do, Admiral Cho said, sounding slightly surprised that he would question this. Suffering is suffering, regardless of species. If we have the capability to help, then we have the responsibility to help. President Han Jiwoo joined them for the afternoon briefing, and Veltar was surprised to discover that the leader of the human colonial government was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who looked more like a teacher than a military commander. She explained that human leadership deliberately chose people who understood the difference between strength and aggression, between protection and conquest. Our military capabilities exist to serve our humanitarian goals, President Han said simply. We are strong so that we can protect the weak, not so that we can dominate them. But surely there must be some humans who see your military strength as an opportunity for expansion or conquest, Veltar suggested. There are always individuals who misunderstand the purpose of power, she agreed. But our entire society is structured to channel that power toward protective, rather than aggressive, ends. Dr. Shin Sung-ho arrived with a collection of technical manuals and research documents that illustrated this point perfectly. He was the chief scientist responsible for human defensive technology development, and his work focused exclusively on creating more effective ways to protect civilians, rather than more efficient ways to destroy enemies. Every weapon system we develop has corresponding humanitarian applications, Dr. Shin explained as he showed Veltar schematics for advanced defensive technologies. Our missile systems can deliver medical supplies as easily as warheads. Our sensor networks monitor for natural disasters as well as hostile forces. Our transport ships can evacuate civilians as quickly as they can deploy troops. The documents revealed something that Veltar had not fully understood before. Human military technology was deliberately designed to be dual-use, capable of both defensive and humanitarian functions. Their rapid expansion throughout the galaxy was not driven by territorial ambition, but by a systematic effort to establish safe havens and response capabilities wherever they might be needed. You have appointed yourselves as protectors for this entire sector of space, Veltar said, finally understanding the scope of human intentions. We have accepted responsibility for this sector of space, President Han corrected gently. No one appointed us. We saw a need and we chose to fill it. What Need. The need for someone to care about the safety of innocent people regardless of their species or citizenship. Admiral Cho showed him classified intelligence reports that documented threats throughout the galaxy, many of which never made it into official Galactic Council briefings. Pirate organizations, slaver networks, rogue military units, criminal cartels. All the predators that thrived in the gaps between official government authority were constantly monitored and countered by human intelligence services. The Galactic Council deals with threats between major civilizations, Admiral Cho explained. But there are thousands of smaller threats that fall between the cracks of official diplomacy. And humans address these smaller threats? We address any threat that endangers innocent people and that no one else is in a position to handle effectively. The most revealing document that Dr. Shin showed him was the official mission statement for human military forces, written in simple language that left no room for misinterpretation. It read, "To ensure that no sentient being in our sphere of influence ever dies helpless and alone, as our ancestors did at Kepler Station, and to provide aid and protection to any who need it regardless of their species, citizenship, or ability. To reciprocate." "This is your actual military doctrine?" Veltar asked. "This is our actual military doctrine," President Han confirmed. "Every human soldier swears an oath to uphold these principles, and every human citizen understands that this is why we maintain our defensive capabilities." As the briefing continued, Veltar began to understand that what he had initially perceived as threatening militarization was actually something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans had created a military force whose primary mission was humanitarian protection rather than territorial conquest, and they had structured their entire society around supporting this mission. "The other species in the galaxy see your rapid expansion and your heavy armament, and they worry that you are preparing for conquest," Veltar said. "We understand their concern," Admiral Cho replied, "but we hope that our actions over time will demonstrate our actual intentions." "Your actions have certainly been consistent with your stated principles," Veltar admitted. That evening, Veltar was invited to observe a ceremony at the memorial garden that honored the victims of Kepler Station. Every human settlement maintained such a memorial, and they were visited regularly by families who wanted their children to understand the history that shaped their society. He watched as parents explained to young children why humans lived the way they did, why every adult learned to fight and every community prepared for emergencies. The children listened solemnly to stories about ancestors who died helpless and afraid, and they promised to honor those memories by ensuring that no one else would ever suffer the same fate. "We tell these stories not to create hatred," one parent explained to her daughter, "but to create responsibility. We remember the dead by protecting the living." The ceremony concluded with a reading of names, all 30,000 people who had died at Kepler Station, and Veltar was moved by the reverence with which the humans honored their dead. This was not a celebration of militarism, but a remembrance of vulnerability, a commitment to never again allow innocence to be defenseless against malice. As he walked back to his quarters that night, Veltar finally understood what he needed to write in his report to the Galactic Council. The humans were not threatening because they were preparing for conquest. They were inspiring because they were preparing for protection. Their heavy armament served a philosophy of universal care rather than species-specific dominance. He began, writing his final report, choosing his words carefully to convey the profound difference between aggressive militarization and protective militarization. The humans had suffered a trauma that could have turned them into conquerors or isolationists, but instead they had chosen to become guardians, using their strength to ensure that others would never experience the helplessness that had once devastated their own people. "The question is not why humans are so heavily armed," he wrote, "but why the rest of us have been content to remain so lightly defended. The humans have not weaponized their society for conquest. They have organized their society for care. They